In this video, I'll be creating an 8-bit style lead sound that's going to sound like this. This sound will make use of some interesting wavetables inside the synthesizer, as well as some of the looping controls that you have on the envelopes inside of Massive. So to create this, let's go ahead and load up our new synth. So I just went ahead and loaded it up just to save a bit of time here. And we have an initialized version of Massive. So let's go ahead and bring the pitch down to -12. So that way we have a lower tone to work with. And you can either do this in the semitone control here on the actual oscillator itself, or you can do this in the global section. Just depends on how you'd like to work. Now let's go ahead and load up the wavetable that we'll be using. This will be underneath the harmonics section, and this is the saw square ratio wavetable. This is basically just a combination of a saw and a square wave, but there's some interesting overtones as well. And in its basic patch, it just sounds like this. And if I was to move this to the right, you can hear all of those different overtones. And what we'll be doing in this patch is just scanning through the different parts in that wavetable with one of our envelopes, and we'll be lighting that up a little bit later. So go ahead and make sure that is turned all the way up in volume. And then we want to go down to our routing section and make sure to route the white noise around our filter section. So that way none of the adjustments we make to our filter change the overall characteristic of our noise. And that's just based on my own personal preference. I like to have my noise sit on top of my synthesizer devices because I usually like to overdrive the filters quite a bit to add a lot of distortion. So that way the noise doesn't get too overpowering for this specific track. Next, we can go ahead and move over to our envelopes and make some adjustments to that. So we want to go ahead and push the attack up slightly to about 30% or so. Leave the decay just above where the attack is. Put the release at 50%. And then we can bring the sustain all the way down. So this gives us a little bit of a sort of a fade in on a stab sound, and it sounds like this. And then we can go ahead and add some white noise in on top of that. So just bump that up slightly, and that sounds like this. And then we also want to go ahead and go to our filter section and overdrive our synth patch. So we'll pull up the Monarch synthesizer filter. We'll bump the resonance up slightly to about where this 4 is. So just point the resonance control at that. And basically what that's doing is making a resonant boost at the cutoff frequency. So it's giving us a little bit more high frequencies in our sound. And so far that sounds like this. So it makes our sound a little bit crunchier sounding. So this would be without that resonance. So everything's a little bit darker. But if we turn that up, everything's a little bit crunchier sounding. And then let's go ahead and overdrive our gain to about 75 or so %. So make it sound a bit fatter. And then we want to go ahead and load up a modulation envelope. And that'll be modulation envelope number 2. And then we want to turn the attack up slightly. Bring the decay all the way down. Bring the release all the way down as well. And make sure the sustain is at 0 and the shape control is at 50%. Then let's go ahead and apply this to the wavetable's position. So bring that almost all the way up. So now this is modulating that, which sounds like this. But you can hear that modulation only happens once because it's set to the gate mode on the envelope. So it's just running the envelope every single time I press a note on my keyboard. But what we want to do is go ahead and run this so it's basically like a low frequency oscillator. So change that to loop mode. And then whenever I press my key, it's going to keep looping this envelope. And that sounds like this. And if I want to adjust the speed of the modulation, that sort of arpeggio sound that's happening, I can adjust the attack. So if we want that to be faster, we can reduce our attack. Or we can make it longer by increasing the attack. So you can get some interesting effects depending on how you adjust all these individual parameters. Then let's go ahead and add in some effects. So go over to the effects section and load in a stereo expander. This is kind of similar to the dimension expander, but this specific effect almost operates more like a chorus rather than a sort of a slapback delay or reverb effect, which is what the dimension expander sounds a little bit more like. So let's bring the amount down to just about there, so about 30% or so. And that sounds like this. So it really widens up that sound. It gives it sort of an environment to take place in, which is something that I'm big with on my synth sounds. And we'll go ahead and load up a reverb. Bring the mix down to just about 15% or so. Push the chorus all the way up so we have a nice and wide and soft sounding reverb. That sounds like this. And you can always adjust the amount of reverb to taste depending on what you like. So you could add a little bit more to make it sound a bit more spacey. which is a nice effect, or you could just bring that down to just about there to get a sound that's a little bit more controlled. So now with that out of the way, let me go ahead and show you those notes that I had in the introduction. So let me just play you back those notes. We may have to make a few little adjustments to the synth patch, but what I'll do is I'll play these back and then we can make any adjustments we might need to make, and then I'll show you those notes. So let's go ahead and go back to the synth, and I want to bump the release up slightly. So that way those notes kind of ring out just a little bit more. And then maybe we could even bring the attack down just a little bit so those modulations happen just a little bit faster. And that'll kind of tighten up that sound. And that sounds like this. Now I can go ahead and show you those notes. So what we have going on here is similar to a kick and snare pattern. We have these lower notes happening at kind of the beginning of each of these different bars and sort of happening right before the bar. And then on this sort of offbeat here, where you normally would have something like a snare drum, we have a higher up note playing back in the same sequence. So what we have is a G note, then there's a rest for several different beats, and then we have another G note, and then halfway through the bar, we have a higher up note, which in our case is also a G as well. We're sort of jumping back between those two different octaves. Then jumps back down to a G note, and that holds for 4 beats. And then we have another G note, then it jumps back up to the other higher up G note halfway through the second bar. So it's kind of that same pattern, similar to what we had beforehand. And then it just repeats one time. If you're using this patch in your compositions, you want to create something that has some interplay between the various different octaves on the keyboard. Because we created this modulated 8-bit arpeggio sound, that's what will sound the most interesting with this type of patch. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next sound design video.